Hello YouTube and welcome to part 2 of the 1911 Random DIY project. What are all these parts? In this segment of the series, we're going to be going over all of the 1911 parts, how they interact with each other, what their jobs are, and as we go along, but more towards the end, we'll also be covering how to identify if you're developing a problem or possibly already have a problem. Now, in the first part of the series, we covered fully disassembling your 1911, and in the next part of the series, we're going to be going over a full reassembly of the 1911 and function testing to make sure that you've reassembled it properly. Stay tuned and enjoy. Okay, so now you've got your gun into pieces, or maybe you just want to know, how everything works. That's what we're going to go over right now, is how do all of these little bits and pieces that you see laid out here interact with each other to make a functioning firearm. Now, let's go ahead and start with the parts from our slide. We've got the firing pin and its spring. We've got the firing pin blocking safety, if applicable to your firearm, and its spring. And we have the extractor. When you fire your gun, you pull the trigger, hammer falls forward. We're going to assume that for starts, you do not have a firing pin blocking safety on your firearm. So you pull the trigger, hammer flies forward, the hammer runs in to the back of the firing pin, which sends it flying forward, smashing into the primer on the back of your cartridge. The primer sets off the powder, which produces all of the pressure to send that hunk of lead down your barrel and out into the world. At the same time as that bullet's traveling down the barrel, equal and opposite reactions, the slide is starting to run backwards, resetting the hammer back to the cocked position, flinging out the empty cartridge, grabbing the next cartridge on its way forward, pushing them up into the barrel, and you're ready to go again. Now, the purpose of the spring for the firing pin is twofold. One, it kind of limits how far out the firing pin can go, how far forward it can go. This prevents it from jamming itself into the firing pin hole in the breech face. Okay. The second point of it is to reset your firing pin back to the ready position and to keep it locked up into your back plate. Now you'll see here you've got a little ridge or head on the back of the firing pin. That gives it a shoulder to where it sticks out through the back plate, right? That allows the hammer to get at it, but it also helps to keep the back plate in place. So there's that. Now the extractor is kind of an anomaly. There are rules for extractors. Extractors don't always have to extract and draw the cartridge out of the chamber. But an extractor must always hold the cartridge up against the breech face until the ejector can get at it and knock it out of the gun. As I mentioned in the first video of this series, this extractor has a hook in it right here, that is what maintains the firing pin blocking safety and plunger in place. It lives down in this little hole here, or it lives inside this hook here so that it can't just come flying up out of the gun. And everything stays nice and tight and you get no problems. Well, how does that work? You know, how's that firing pin blocking safety work? And what happens is that the firing pin, you saw that little hourglass shape that it's got right in here. That rests in the cutout notch of the safety, of that safety plunger. So, well, the main part when the gun is not being fired, the solid part is actually what lives into that hourglass shape. Then what will happen is when you pull the trigger, there's a little lever that gets activated that lives down in the frame. It presses that firing pin blocking safety up so that it aligns with the wider portion of the firing pin and lets it ride by. If the solid part of the plunger is in that hourglass area, that firing pin can't move forward, or moves forward very minimally, but not enough to protrude through your breech face. So that plunger has to come up and align with the firing pin, align its cutout with the firing pin so that the firing pin can just go running right on through. That's how that works. We'll get to how the lever actually gets activated here in a few minutes. So your firing pin, your extractor, that's all covered. Next part we're going to talk about is the actual firing mechanisms, so to speak. You got your trigger. Okay? On your trigger, at the back here, you can see, you've got a short top and a slightly longer bottom. Okay? The longer side is the bottom. That's important to note for reassembly. So, your trigger's sitting in the gun. Then you have what's called a disconnector. This is your disconnector. Okay? It's got a paddle down here on one end with a flat face on one side and kind of a ridge face on the other side that's at an angle. Okay? The flat face of the disconnector is what actually rests against the back of the trigger bow. Then on the top side, you just have this rounded, pin-shaped top. And you got this great big hole in the middle of it. Okay? So, the disconnector sits directly behind the trigger. Then you have your sear. Okay? The sear has this great big hook in it. It's got two tabs at the bottom. Great long notch that fits all the way through. Plus it has a hole in the side of it. The sear is what actually grabs onto your hammer and holds it in place. The sear also lives on top, actually wrapped around your disconnector. Something like so. Those two tabs rest just behind the disconnector. Just behind the back of the paddle on the disconnector. So if the disconnector is in the up position, which is the firing position, then it gets in the way of the sear so that when the trigger pushes on it, it moves the sear. If the disconnector is in the down position, which is what happens when the gun is out of battery, meaning the slide's not all the way forward, then the disconnector sits below the sear and doesn't move it at all. It's not touching those tabs on the bottom. This prevents your sear from slipping off of the hammer while the gun is cycling, or if the gun's not locked up all the way. This is important. That's why the disconnector has such a big hole in it, because the sear stays in one location, but the disconnector moves up and down and pivots back and forth and moves, more than pivots, but actually kind of shifts back and forth throughout. So far we know that the trigger pushes on the disconnector. The disconnector pushes on the sear. And I can actually give you a slightly better demonstration of this, sort of. And we also know that the sear is what locks onto the hammer and holds it in place. So there's the safe notch. The sear is sitting in the safe notch right now, which is this upper notch. Now the sear is caught on the full cock notch. When the sear pivots out of the way, hammer falls. So to try and give you a better visual on that, I've got a couple of slave pins here. One's large enough to fit through the hammer and its pinhole in the frame, like so. Turn this way a little bit. The other will get through the disconnector and the sear and get them in place, like so. And then we'll just kind of lay the hammer, or the trigger up here, and it'll sit there. Now, I'm going to see if I can do this. Okay. So, hammer sitting up. The sear and disconnector are sitting down here. Alright. Hammer cocks all the way back. That sear is now locked onto the hammer. Disconnector is up. It just touches the tabs on the bottom of that sear. And when the trigger is pulled, hammer falls. Hey, Singing Wolf, you're having a hard time holding that sear and disconnector and everything in place, and everything's just flopping all over the place. The reason for that is that the sear spring produces tension for 3 different areas. Starting right to left when you're looking at the sear from the back when it's in the gun, or left to right I should say. You've got the longest leg, which is the one with that hook on it. Okay? That hook, I had mentioned in the other video that that hook is what pushes on the sear. That wasn't entirely accurate. That leg with the hook is what pushes on the sear. But the hook itself rests next to the sear, while the non-hooked portion of it, right, you can see that the hook doesn't go all the way across. It's just off to the edge. That hook wraps around the side of the sear, but this front piece here, or this non-hooked area here, is what presses on the sear itself, giving the sear tension. It's pushing the bottom of the sear forward, which is pushing the top of the sear back towards the hammer. The middle leg on the sear spring actually rests on the back of the disconnector, which is what gives it its forward tension, keeping it in line, letting it reset, pushing it back up into position when the slide is closed all the way. And then the final leg that's bent way out from everybody else, that leg is there for giving tension to your grip safety. Now wait, Singing Wolf, you said that the disconnector has to move up in the frame, and if it's protruding up in the frame, how's it going? How can it go up in the frame if the slide is there? Now there is a hole in the frame here that goes all the way through. If I can get this thing to fall down in there. There we go. Goes all the way through. You can see the disconnector sticking up right there. But how can it go up there if there's a slide in the way? The simple answer for that is if you look at the bottom of your slide, you'll see this little cutout notch right here. The disconnector actually lifts up into that notch. Then when the slide runs back on recoil, it pushes the disconnector back down. Then when the slide closes again, that center leg of the sear spring pushes it back up into this hole and in line with the sear. So we've covered the trigger, the fact that it bumps in to the disconnector, which bumps into the sear, which slips off the hammer, hammer flies forward, bumps into the firing pin bumps into the primer, gun go bang. So, what about that firing pin blocking safety? Well, that's where these two other little parts that fell out of your gun came from, if your gun has a firing pin blocking safety. You have a lifter, which is this little guy here, and you have a lever, which is this big guy here. The trigger bumps in to this thick tail of the lifter. The little nose on the lifter bumps into the lever. The lever rises, pushing on that firing pin blocking safety plunger, aligning it with the firing pin so that the firing pin can move forward unhindered. Now when you're reassembling this, and I'll go over that again in the next video, but when you're reassembling this, You have to be careful on how you put these back into the gun so that they will function properly. I had reassembled this pistol once before where the lever slipped out of position, so instead of the small nose of the lever, let's see if I can get this to show, resting under this little flat spot sticking off of the lever, the small nose of the lifter, instead of being down there to push the lever up, actually wound up alongside of it. So the lifter would move, but the lever wouldn't. Pulled the trigger, misfire. Hold it down, stayed aimed downrange, waited about 20 seconds, racked the round out, put the magazine, checked, didn't see any damage to the round, set that round aside, put the magazine back in it, racked in a new round, pulled the trigger, misfire. Gun's not going bang. What in the heck? Well, it wasn't until I got it back to the shop, disassembled it, and I was in the middle of the disassembly process. I pulled out the mainspring housing, the sear spring, and I happened to see down in here where they live that during assembly had slipped up next to the lever and wasn't engaging it the way it should. That was my fault. That was my problem. I screwed up. I should have had a suspicion about it when I looked at the back of the cartridge and didn't see any kind of dimple in the primer at all. There was nothing there. Not seeing a dimple on the primer of your cartridge is a good indication that the firing pin blocking safety is not disengaging. And so the firing pin is not running all the way forward to make contact with the primer. Well, what's the point of it? The point of it is so that if something were to happen, let's say that the relationship between the hammer and the sear got to where the hammer was just sliding right off of the sear and flying forward on its own. Or let's say it got smacked hard enough, you dropped it or something and the hammer went flying forward. It slipped off of the sear, went flying forward and hit the back of the firing pin. Well, this lifter and lever only move when the trigger moves them, which means that the firing pin blocking safety only disengages when the trigger is pulled. So that if you had some instance where the hammer came flying forward without the trigger being pulled, you're not going to get an accidental discharge when it hits that firing pin, because the firing pin is going to be stopped by that firing pin blocking safety. So that's where those two levers come in. That's how they come into play. Next bits we'll talk about, we're going to go into a little bit more about the trigger and the sear. Okay. Now, you saw before, and it's hard to pick up on this camera because, well, this camera sucks. We have a big notch over here. We have a small notch over here. The big notch is basically your safe notch. Okay, so that if for some reason, typically speaking, if for some reason the hammer slips off of the sear, it should catch on that safe notch and not go all the way forward to make contact with the firing pin. Well, how would that happen? The firing, or the hammer and the sear have a very specific relationship. They're two angles. Grab a pencil here because it'll be easier to draw this out than anything else. So we have the hammer and we have the sear. Okay. Now, the angle of the notches on the hammer need to be positive, which means when there's pressure on the hammer pushing it, trying to push it forward, it wants to push that sear deeper in. So to give you an exaggerated view of this, you'll be looking at something like this, right? So as the hammer's trying to push forward, right, it's going to be pushing these parts down. Because of the angle here or here, it's going to try and shove the sear deeper towards the center of the hammer, all right, further in, rather than falling off. If the hammer notches are neutral or negative, okay, we're going to call this one a neutral slot. It's just basically flat across. And we're going to call this one a negative. Okay, if your sear is resting on this negative, with that forward pressure, it's just going to want to push that sear out of the way. With the neutral, it might just stay balanced there, but either way it's not good. Now, the face of the sear is also typically positive. And here's kind of an exploded view. So that there's a nice sharp angle here that causes the sear to want to push further into the hammer. This makes the gun safe in the sense that the hammer and the sear are going to want to live together. But it also gives you a better trigger pull in most cases. If you've got a negative or a neutral, okay, if you've got a negative here, when you start to pull that trigger, you're going to just feel that sear just, sliding its way off. There's not going to be a sharp snap of a release. It's just going to kind of creep forward, and then the hammer's going to fall. The same with the neutral. You're not going to have as crisp of a trigger pull because the sear is just going to want to creep right off. So that's that engagement area and engagement angles are very important, which is why I do not recommend that the average user pull apart their gun to try and file away at their sear or change the angle on their hammer to get a better trigger pull or to lighten the trigger pull. Take your firearm to a competent gunsmith that knows how to do the work. Otherwise, you can run into some serious problems. Another problem that can arise from having a negative engagement area is as the slide runs back, right? The slide runs back, pushing the hammer back. Then the slide runs forward. Well, if the hammer just slips right off of the sear, the hammer's just could possibly just follow the slide all the way back forward again. Now the gun won't go bang because the hammer's got nowhere to go. It's already back forward. Conceivably, if there was just enough engagement on the between the sear and the hammer to where it's just that final bump of the slide ramming home to its forward position that causes it to disengage, and you do not have the firing pin blocking safety, it is conceivable that your firearm could full auto, but more often than not, you're going to get hammer follow down instead. Now, you saw me when I was disassembling the gun, this strut sticking off the back of the hammer, right? That is what pushes down inside your mainspring housing on that plunger that shows at the top side. That's what gives the hammer all of its power. When it pivots back, I'm going to grab my slave pin here, kind of assemble this. So when the hammer pivots back, it actually pushes this strut down, basically loading the spring that's inside the mainspring housing. When the trigger is released, all that force is transferred up through that strut, forcing the hammer back forward again. As I said before, the relationship between the parts of your firearm is very important. The angles that they engage each other at, not having the right angles could cause you to have an unsafe firearm. I'm not talking about just a firearm that might full auto or, do a burst shot on you. If your safeties aren't fitted properly, then they won't work. Such as with the thumb safety, it's conceivable that the gun could fire with the thumb safety in the on position, which, when the thumb safety is in its on position, it slips up into this notch right here. If the gun goes off with that with that sitting up in that notch, what do you think is going to happen? You could get a barrel blowout back here at the chamber. You could shred the safety off of your gun, possibly damaging your slide, possibly damaging your frame where the safety sits in at, which is here and back here. It can cause all sorts of problems. That's why, unless you know what you're doing, I do not recommend making any changes to your firearm. Now let's talk about the safeties here momentarily. Okay, we've got our trigger, right? We got the trigger sitting there. We got that grip safety thing, right? Now if you look at the grip safety, you see it's got this nose sticking way off of it. What happens is when the grip safety is not being pushed in, that nose rests against the back of the trigger bow, right? Then when you get a good grip on the gun, and you see the pivot holes way up here, the bottom pushes in, tilting that nose up out of the way, allowing the trigger room to move. When you let go, it blocks the trigger again. That's an important thing to know. And in the next video, when we do the reassembly, I'll show you how to test to make sure that that's functioning properly. Now what about that thumb safety? How's that one work? This one's a little harder to see, but you see this big chunk down here, right? It's all sorts of crazy shaped. That slips in and actually blocks the sear itself from moving. It slips into this area here and gets in the way of it so that it can't move. All right, you gotta realize, right here's your pivot hole. If this bottom section this bottom half of the sear cannot move, it can't come off of the hammer. Hammer can't run forward. So that's how this works. Now, if you watch the other video, you know that this particular firearm has the ambidextrous safety. Okay, which means it's got a thumb pad for either side. And you saw me pry this side off, the side from the right side of the gun, pry it off with a screwdriver without wiggling everything into the half on, half off position. The reason for that is if you look at this safety, right, it only has the one peg sticking out, whereas the other side has what actually blocks the sear and the pin, which is what holds your grip safety in place. The reason why I was able to just pry this side off is that when you look closely, you'll see that its one pin is just slotting. That slot fits around this one's pin, which has a tapered point on it. Okay? They just slip together like it's nothing. Although this one's pretty tight, which is why I pry it off with a screwdriver. So they just snap together like that. Which is why you can remove the right side just by prying it off, but the left side has to come out in the half on, half off position. And part of that is because of how that large lump is shaped. You have to basically, the half on, half off position basically gets some of the notches that are in this out of the way of everything so that it can just slide out. So there's your safeties, all covered. Grip safety is covered. The firing pin blocking safety is covered. The thumb safeties are covered. There's a lot of safeties in this gun. I mean, 3 safeties. My Smith & Wesson SD40VE has a firing pin blocking safety. And the only other safety is this hinged trigger that the top end of it bumps into the frame here, and so the trigger can't move back unless this bottom half of the trigger is pulled to move that top tail out of the way. You can actually kind of see it slipping up out of the way a little bit down there. It's only got 2 safeties on it. It was designed that way. So 3 safeties, we've covered them all. Before we go any further, checking your parts to see if they're wearing out or might be developing an issue, let's talk about the magazine release. Okay, now you can't really see it, but basically I showed the little tab on that screw-faced portion of the magazine release. And when we disassembled the magazine release, you saw how it pivoted out of the way, came into the main notch, and slid out. That little tab, when it's in the gun and aligned with that large notch that runs parallel with the rest of the magazine release body, it actually rests against the frame, which is what locks it into the frame. So that when you push it in and turn it over to that little side slot, it takes all the spring pressure off, but it also disengages it from the frame to allow you to remove it. The magazine release itself is pretty straightforward. This little shelf that's here on the inside, this little shelf that's right here, is what actually catches on a notch in your magazine and holds it up into place. This is held in by that other pin and its spring into the frame. So also what lets this spring in and out for its own, for catching and releasing the magazine. And let's see, what other parts do we have here? I kind of went over the mainspring housing a little bit. Now that everything's out of the gun, let's see if I can get you to see the pin that's inside. You can kind of see it off to the side there, that little bit of shiny spot inside the hole. That's the pin that holds the plungers and everything into the mainspring housing. Sorry, I didn't have a mini flashlight, had to use the headlamp. So we've got 2 plungers and a big heavy-duty spring in the mainspring housing. Okay, as I mentioned in the last video, the bottom plunger is cone-shaped. It sits down through a hole that kind of allows the tip to point down into the retaining pin hole and locks the retaining pin into place when it engages this little groove that's here in the middle. Okay. The top plunger, which I didn't really talk about other than identifying it, has a dimple in it. That dimple is where the hammer strut actually kind of gets itself seated and pushes down, pushes up on it. So you don't get as much binding inside the mainspring housing, given that the hammer strut gets kind of locked into position by that dimple. I also mentioned in the disassembly video these 2 small plungers and that little spring that's running away. The larger of the 2 plungers, I actually got this backwards. The larger of the 2 plungers, which is this one here, you can kind of see you got the big plunger and you've got the little plunger. The little plunger has a little shoulder on it. The big plunger is just smooth the whole way out. The larger plunger pushes on this kind of ramped engagement area of your thumb safety. That's what allows it to snap up and snap down. The smaller plunger has 2 jobs. First, that shoulder is what locks it into this tube, prevents it from flying out this end. Whereas the thumb safety is what prevents the larger plunger from flying out that end. So it keeps the little plunger and spring assembly inside the tube. The second job is to press on your slide stop slash takedown pin, but your slide stop. Okay, now that's the smaller end here just kind of presses against the side. It presses against this side here. That helps prevent it from just kind of slipping out. It gives it some spring tension there to kind of keep it locked into place. Your magazine will have a follower in it, and the follower will actually catch on the bottom of this hooked area and push it up, which is why when the gun's empty, the slide locks back. So, we've covered all of the trigger parts, we've covered the magazine release, we've covered all of the safeties, we've covered the extractor, firing pin, slide stop / takedown lever, the sear spring, the main spring housing. I think we've covered just about everything for function and how they work with each other. One quick point to note is that this is the recoil spring, the recoil cap, or the recoil spring cap or plug. When the gun recoils, this thing has two jobs. One, to reduce the amount of felt recoil. So some of that energy of the slide running backwards is being absorbed by this spring. But this spring's main duty is to shove that slide back forward, stripping around off the magazine, shoving it into the chamber, and pushing the slide back up into battery. That's the main purpose, other than absorbing some of the energy of the slide moving rearward. It's more important that this push the slide back into battery than anything else. The guide rod's there just to keep everything in place. The barrel has a lug on it, and then has a link. Okay. The link is what keeps the barrel attached to the frame, and what moves the barrel, what allows the barrel to drop into position for, well, allows the barrel to, one, drop out of engagement with the slide. You see the slots up here. Those actually correspond with a couple of slots in the frame, or in the slide itself. That's called the lockup, and these are the locking lugs. That link, when the barrel moves backwards with the slide, it also shoves the barrel down off of the slide, so it loses its engagement with the slide, so that the slide can continue running back. Eject the empty, come forward, grab a fresh round, stuff it into the chamber, shove the barrel back up into position to fire. Okay. Going into stuff like that is a much more in-depth video. Relationship between link length, engagement of the locking lugs, etc. It's not. It is beyond the purview of this video series. All right. Now, I said before that I was going to tell you how you can start to notice if your parts are starting to wear out, or if you might be developing a problem. Now, we already covered one problem, which was with the firing pin blocking safety and the lever and lifter. If they're not put in properly, you could run into problems where you pull the trigger and gun don't go bang. So to head back to, and we kind of went over problems with the engagement areas between the sear and the hammer. Now, something that you'll note, that you should also note, is if your sear, if the nose of your sear becomes very rounded, right? Rounded down, starts to wear over, your sear should fully engage the full cock notch of your hammer, so that when the sear is in place, it should be all the way inside the notch. If your sear is not getting full depth into the notch of your hammer, into the full cock notch of your hammer, you could be developing a problem. A lot of times, at least when I've found, is that the lack of engagement there is caused by the nose of that, the tip of that sear starting to round over and become fat, so it doesn't fit all the way in that hammer notch. Something to look out for. Your sear should be crisp. It should be, kind of sharp. It should have flat angles to it. It should be positive. Another thing you want to watch for is your hammer. On the hammer, those notches need to be sharp. They need to be well defined. You want to make sure that they've got enough engagement area on them. And this is why I say take it to a qualified gunsmith as well, is because you saw the engagement areas, especially, is not focusing, especially on the full cock notch here, isn't very large. Some guns you have a great big full cock notch that you can work with. Something like this has a very shallow full cock notch. That gives it a shorter, crisper trigger pull, but it also makes it that much more difficult to adjust when needed. Okay? Take your guns to a gunsmith. As I said in the introductions, this is for the purposes of cleaning all of your internal parts, which is very important. But I don't recommend it for every gun, because there are some guns that you just don't want to tear. The average user shouldn't tear apart. There are some guns out there that unless you take certain parts out in a certain order, in a certain way, and put them back in a certain order, in a certain way, it's going to be all sorts of bad, and you're going to run into problems. Those are the two main areas that you want to watch out for wear is your sear, your sear nose, your hammer notches. Also, your pinholes. If you're seeing damage, like on your disconnector, if this hole is like starting to really bulge out, like you've got a big old dimple notch in it somewhere from where it's been beating against the pin, you might want to take it to a gunsmith and have it fitted, have a new one put in, fitted properly, etc. And that goes for all of your pinholes. If the hole doesn't look like it should, you should take your gun to a gunsmith and have them correct it. Other than that, I think that pretty much covers how all the parts interact with each other. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for the third installment of this series, which will be covering detailed reassembly, as well as how to function check the firearm to make sure that you reassembled it properly. Thanks for watching. I know that these videos are running kind of long, and I'm glad if you made it to the very end. I could have done this a lot faster, but I wanted to make sure that I did it properly and that I covered all of the important details. Because when you strip apart a firearm like this, it's very easy to just skip over something that's important, and you never realize that, hey, there could be a problem there, or hey, there's a wrong way of putting this back in, or a wrong way of taking this out, and it could cause all sorts of problems for you. So I'm sorry about how long these videos are running, but I really do want to do right by you and make sure that everything is covered. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you at the next one.